Welcome back to the Sportsnaut interview. Amateur sports, are they a thing of the past? Maybe. A landmark ruling this past week that affects college sports could start the ball rolling on that. And to talk about it, we bring in Amanda Christovich from Front Office Sports. She's been on top of this story from the get-go, and that is the Dartmouth men's basketball team this week, thanks to the National Labor Relations Board, now gets their case moved forward. They're trying to unionize, and the National Labor Relations Board has said that they qualify as university employees. Very interesting. So, Amanda, I want to jump in and start at the top for this because I think, for a lot of folks that don't necessarily cover the business of sports, which college sports is obviously a huge business, they might not know exactly what the issue is here. Everybody knows about name, image, and likeness, NIL now, and that players can get paid in college, but they don't know the wider issue. Give us kind of the 50,000-foot level on what the Dartmouth men's basketball team was trying to do here and how this all came about.
Yeah, so I think the biggest, confusion that people have is, so name, image, and likeness does allow players to get paid, right? But they can't be paid by their school. Name, image, and likeness is a weird term that, the college sports industry essentially came up with to say endorsement deals, to say private, personal business ventures, right? So like an NIL deal is a sponsorship deal with a shoe company. It's writing an album and being able to sell your own CDs. It's you creating a startup with some of your teammates, right? It's all of the rights to your personal, your face and your name and the ability to market that, that every single person in the United States of America has the right to, including normal students, right? So when athletes got those rights back, right, because they used to have to sign them away, the next question became, okay, well, are they going to get paid by the university? Because they're not allowed to be paid by the university through NIL deals, right? Are they going to get salaries? Are they going to be considered employees of the university? And that's the question that the Dartmouth case is about, right? It's not about NIL. NIL is something that is completely separate. It's about the relationship between the players and the school and whether or not that, constitutes employment and all of the benefits and rights that come with an employment status under U.S. labor law.
Yeah, very interesting in the finding, because I know going back, and maybe you can explain the difference. I think a lot of folks might remember when the Northwestern football team tried to unionize, and that's what Dartmouth's men's team did, right? They reached out to the Service Employees International Union, petitioned to become a unionized group, and that's how this all started. What's the difference? Why in this case, where the Labor Relations Board found that there was two criteria, right? You talk about in the piece you wrote about it after it broke, which was about control and compensation. Mm-hmm. What's the difference here now with this Dartmouth case versus maybe some of the others that were following before that were trying to argue the same thing, basically?
Yeah, the Northwestern case is interesting because at this stage, in the Northwestern case, the Northwestern players also won. So the Dartmouth players won at the regional National Labor Relations Board level, right? The NLRB, kind of like the regular courts, is split up into different districts. And then there's a national board in DC that hears appeals, right? So the regional director decided that Northwestern football players were also employees. It was on appeal that the national board didn't say they weren't employees, but just declined to exercise jurisdiction and decide either way, because they looked at college sports and they said, okay, so we're the National Labor Relations Board. We only have jurisdiction over the private sector. A lot of these schools are public schools, so we can't rule on them. And we can't, so we would create not only a discrepancy in the NCAA, but even down to the Big Ten level, right? Looking at Northwestern and versus all the other schools in the Big Ten. So they just said, you know what, we're not going to rule either way. They didn't say they weren't employees. Here, right? So at the same level, these players have won. But they've won a much stronger case because the regional director has almost like preemptively addressed that jurisdiction argument by saying, hey, this is the Ivy League, not the Big Ten. Every single Ivy League school is a private school. So we have jurisdiction across the entire conference. So, national board, take note of that.
Yes. And it's interesting, too, because like you talked about the bigger schools, you're talking Big Ten, you're talking the SEC. These are schools that offer also scholarships. Ivy League doesn't have scholarships, right? For the most part,
right.
When you're talking about that. So a very different argument. But when you look at the kind of gravity of this, and as you talk about in your piece and the other coverage, the ruling itself, it's going to take a few years for this to work itself through the system. But just the shockwaves that this sends through college and amateur sports overall. Talk a little bit about that and the impact, because, of course, you got the people who are going to be apocalyptic and say it's the end of everything. And then you have other people who say, well, no, some universities now are going to have to figure out how they do this. It's a reality. How do you think that's all going to shake out, and where's it going?
I think this is a confirmation of a direction that college sports has been heading in for the past several years. And the NCAA has been fighting tooth and nail against the power. There was a Power 5. Now you could say it's a Power 4. But for the entity, for the purposes of lobbying and congressional intervention, they're still a Power 5, right? The Pac-12 is still paying lobbying firms, right? So they've been fighting against this, even instead of anticipating that a ruling like this was going to happen and preemptively thinking, okay, how are we going to adjust, right? They're playing defense and they're losing. And they're losing, and they're fighting battles all across the country. They're in lawsuits all across the country. They have to bat 1,000 if they want to keep the amateurism model in place. They're not going to be able to. So, did amateurism die on, when was it, Monday? I think it was Monday. All the days blend together on this beat. Did amateurism die on Monday? No, but was it a confirmation that amateurism is on life support and probably isn't going to wake up? Yes. That's kind of how I've been describing it to people. And so as far as the few years thing goes, it's like, yes, it just depends how stubborn the NCAA is. Do they really want to appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court? They're going to, but it's like they have two options. Either they can adjust with this ruling in mind, or they could not adjust. And so we won't see any legal changes for a few years, but it's going to be a lot less gradual, let's say a few years down the road when there is a final ruling.
It's very interesting to me because I worked in NCAA sports. I worked at my alma mater, and so I know it from the inside. And the NCAA, for a long time, kind of just did whatever they want. There was nothing going on there. And then suddenly now they've been challenged over and over again in the last few years. So whether or not they'll still be around in some way, it's an interesting question, maybe for a different time. But at the same time, a lot of the discussion around, the end of amateurism, like you talked about at the beginning of your answer, is, these schools have been making hundreds of millions of dollars for years with these athletes, and they've not seen any of it. And you can argue, okay, they get scholarships and all that, but that's not necessarily equitable when you look at the amount of money coming into these universities, what goes to coaches versus what goes to support staff. There's all sorts of intricacies here and there. And I know a lot of people were concerned, as I did. I worked in Olympic sports, or i.e. non-revenue sports, some of the women's sports. And people were concerned that this might be the end of it, but not really, right? Because those are non-revenue sports.
Right. And, so a few things on that, because it's a fear-mongering tactic that the NCAA has been using since the days of NIL. They said NIL would be the end of women's sports and Olympic sports. I'm not even going to try to explain their argument there because it made literally no sense. I think maybe this one makes a little more sense if you're not paying attention. They're saying that if you have to pay if the schools have to pay the players, most of the schools don't make a profit. That's true, right? That's fair. So they're going to lose money. So they're going to have to cut sports, and the first sports on the chopping block are going to be the ones that don't turn a profit. It's going to be the women's sports. It's going to be the Olympic sports. So a few things, right? First of all, with the women's sports, doesn't matter how much money you make or lose to the laws in this country. We have a statute called Title IX. It protects, equitable opportunities across, for all genders. And so literally, like, you could lose $10 million, you could lose $100 million, you could lose $500 million. You still have to provide equitable opportunities. And by the way, think about the public high school in your area. How do you think they're making millions of dollars? They also have a robust sports program, right? Like in high school, I ran track, okay? My school isn't making money off of track. Like, there are ways, okay, to have robust sports programs without bringing in $200 million, okay?
Right.
So it's less about this is the end of the world. It's more about there needs to be change in the way that the funding model exists. If the current funding model stands, yeah, like I think sports would have to be cut in a lot of places, but that's only because the athletic departments don't want to change how they fund sports, and they don't want to get
Right. That's the crux of it right there. You hit on it. And my question two more for you. One is on how this impacts other cases. We know of a big case at USC. It's an unfair labor practice case, I believe, that's still in the court system as well. Mm-hmm. When you look at this Dartmouth case, because just, if you study law at all, my mom was a lawyer, so I was around it a lot, you know that it's all based on precedent, right? So stuff starts to happen, and then if you have a case that's being run through the system at the same time, it can greatly impact what you're doing. What does the rest of the landscape look like in this area when it comes to cases like this, and how this will impact it?
Obviously, this is going to only bolster the position of, the athlete advocates in the USC case, which is, as you said, saying that athletes at USC who play football and basketball should be employees, but not just of the school, of the conference and the NCAA as well. And that, that's potentially an even bigger deal, because that allows for jurisdiction, like legally, over public school athletes, right? Because all the public school athletes are part of conferences and or the NCAA, so that's how they get it, the public school athletes, through the NLRB, right? Essentially, I was told it's not going to decide the ruling for USC, but obviously it's going to be mentioned, and a lot of the arguments that were made in the Dartmouth case are also being made in the USC case. So I imagine, I don't see how that case goes the wrong way. And, the advocate who brought the case, Ramogi Huma, even before this ruling in Dartmouth, he told me he thought that, based on the testimony, he thought that he was going to win in the USC case. Where it gets a little questionable is the federal court system. There's a case called Johnson in the Third Circuit, and that case is arguing that Division I players should be employees and get minimum wage under so the NLRB is under the National Labor Relations Act, right? That other case is the FLSA. So it's a slightly different set of standards for employee status, but it's actually, I believe, it's a broader umbrella than the NLRA's. So also means that they'll likely, it's going to be hard for them to argue against it. However, one thing I saw in the opinion in the Dartmouth case was that the regional director wrote, there are previous rulings about athlete employee status in the federal court systems, but I'm not bound to them. So I do wonder if that could be argued in the other direction, if a federal court still wants to say that athletes are not employees. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So it's really up to the judge's discretion, because ultimately, the supreme precedent is the Supreme Court. That's why there are circuit splits that go to the Supreme Court. Anyone lower than the Supreme Court, it appears you can argue against these days.
Yes. And it's interesting. I have a good friend who is an athletic director at a mid-major school. And I talked to him about it, and his point of view was, and he was concerned, but also recognizes how there's been a sea change, right? The sea change has happened. It's coming. You got to prepare for it. But he even talked about things like you're talking about, where you get to the federal level, and suddenly if they're employees, if athletes are employees of the school, a public school, and a conference and the NCAA, then you're talking about how many hours they work. So, we know how much time athletes put in, especially at the Division I level. Then you're starting to talk about benefits. You're starting to talk about all sorts of things. So there's really some layers here. And I know we're not going to have answers for years on this, but it's fascinating to watch it. And I appreciate the work you're doing. One more question for you. If we could fast forward and we go 3-5 years from now, is the NCAA still the organization it is today, or do you think all of this is going to culminate in some sort of new body that will oversee whatever is decided in these cases?
I think ultimately that's up to the NCAA. If the NCAA's national office, and they make the case that their decisions are really made by their membership. They've got this sort of Kafkaesque bureaucracy that, keeps them from liability. It's like, the Spider-Man meme where it's like two Spider-Mans are looking at each other and they're like, you're me and I'm you. That's what they do in court. They're like, no, it's the school's fault. And it's like, no, it's the NCAA's fault. And it's like, I'm living in a Franz Kafka novel where the bureaucracy, I don't know. Anyway, sorry, I'm just venting now.
I love it.
I think if the NCAA wants to be the body that oversees college sports, just like the NFL oversees the NFL, right? They can be. But what they're going to have to do is change.
Yes. And that sometimes, and a lot of times, and in this case for sure, would mean ceding control in certain areas and looking at it from a whole different perspective and coming up with a new model to do so. Mm-hmm. And we know people in general resist change. And you talk about an organization that's made so much money over the years and done what they've wanted to do. And suddenly now the rules change and you're like, well, wait a minute, can we do this? So it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens there. But I commend you. You've done such great work for Front Office Sports. Amanda Christovich, thank you so much. And we'll catch up next time we have something going on. We'll catch up with you and get an update from you. But we certainly appreciate you being with us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.